Welcome to another episode of the Collective Evolution podcast here. Having some good friends of the show back on again to have a conversation, and we're kind of hoping we can make this a little bit of a regular thing. But I'm going to be talking with David Helfrich and Dr. Madhava Setty once again. In this particular discussion, we get into a number of things around the eclipse that we just had, solar eclipse, some of the astrological and astronomical implications of that, as well as just kind of what emerges out of what appears to be a time where humanity's consciousness, humanity's way of thinking just continually is changing as revelations in the realm of politics and the realm of current events continue to open up our minds and hopefully produce a less rigid human being, but one that is a little more curious, a little more open, a little more heart-centered. So we're going to talk about a number of different very pertinent events as it relates to this discussion. This will include some discussion around the upcoming U.S. election and the ways in which these discussions around RFK Jr. are making their way into the mainstream and how that's kind of flipping some perspectives a little bit. And we'll also get a little bit into some previous historical events and how perspectives are changing on those as new things are being revealed. Without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Well, gentlemen, it's good to have you guys back on. We kind of talked about having almost like a monthly chit chat, so this is fun to be back having another talk here so quick. First off, how you guys doing?
Doing great. Doing great. It's good to see you guys. We're a little late on our monthly powwow, but here we are. Good to be with you.
Yeah.
hmm Yeah, I'm doing all right. Got a lot of stuff happening in my world, but this is one of my highlights is to talk to you guys.
Likewise.
That's all. Sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I know we're coming up. We're actually shooting this the day before the eclipse, and I know that we'll be releasing it about 10 days or so after. But we were chatting on Telegram, just going back and forth about all things like we always do, and some interesting stuff came up around the eclipse, revelations, things that are changing out there in the world, and some interesting stuff happening in current events. And we said, hey, let's jump on and talk about it. So Madhava, why don't you start us off? Because I know you were kind of going over some of the significance from an astronomical and an astrological perspective of the eclipse, and maybe we can use that as a starting point to unpack some more stuff. So why don't you dive into that?
Absolutely. Yes. For your listeners, tomorrow's eclipse, April 8th, and I am going to go see it, totality, up in probably northern Vermont tomorrow. And I've made arrangements to get away from work to go do this. So this is something I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And yeah, as you said, Joe, I wanted to talk about it astrologically and astronomically. Now, astronomically, we know what an eclipse is, a solar eclipse. The moon is getting in the way of the sun. And this obviously happens frequently all over the place in our solar system. We've got 8 planets and, hundreds of moons. Things are always eclipsing each other out there. But something is very, very special about the eclipses, a solar eclipse on the Earth, because the relative sizes of the moon and the sun in the sky are almost exactly the same, which is amazing, right? Because we all know the sun is massive and the moon is relatively tiny, but they're 400 times different in their distance, and that makes their size in the sky almost exactly the same, which is a remarkable coincidence. And I don't happen to know if that exists anywhere else in the solar system. It probably does in other solar systems, but this is pretty amazing. And the reason why it's so cool is that when the moon moves in front of the sun directly, and you have this thing called totality, you then are able to see the sun's corona, which is usually hidden from the sun's light. And to be able to see this in our sky in the middle of the day, I would imagine would be quite stunning. And that's what people say, and this has been happening obviously for time immemorial. And now that we have an understanding of this is a predictable event, it doesn't necessarily carry all of the gloom and doom that might have been in people's minds centuries ago when we didn't know why this was occurring. So the first thing is, this is a remarkable event because of the Earth and the Moon and the Sun, the Moon and the Sun, primarily their sizes. We also have to stop and say, boy, it's pretty incredible that we're able to predict this with such uncanny precision. And that also, for me, is quite remarkable. And, kudos to all the astronomers out there that have been able to map this time after time again. And the reason beyond the beauty that I'm expecting in the sky, let's pray for a sunny day in New England. That's potentially more miraculous than the sun and the earth. Is that I can understand why the astrologers put significance on this. It's not easy to sort of understand how they think about things, but in 1992, I was up in the Arctic for 7 weeks on a scientific expedition, and I didn't see the night sky for 50 days. And that was really jarring. And I can see how important and significant this kind of event would be in the sky, to be out there in the sun and suddenly it turning into night. And to me, this means that we have interrupted the cycle of day and night that we just take for granted all the time as being, immutable, and we throw a wrench in it just for a few minutes. So I think that this is a very important event, astronomically and astrologically. And what I'd like to talk to you guys about right now is how is this manifesting in the collective?
Yeah.
We're approaching it, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen for those 3 minutes. It's like the lead up, the lead off, and to close out this little part here, what I'd like to say is the last time that we had a total solar eclipse in the 48 states was in 2017 at the end of August, and I didn't witness that, but I'm personally speaking, just a few weeks later, my life completely changed. And it had to do with actually looking into 9/11 for the first time, and the entire course of my life was redirected. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's because the moon influenced the way I thought, uh, which is sometimes a way to dismiss this entire metaphysics behind these kinds of events. It's like, oh, come on, like how is something up there going to change the way I think? I think it's more relevant to consider it that we're part of a solar system, a conscious solar system that is in its natural course of evolution, and these kinds of celestial events are markers. They're like it's like clockwork, and something happens discreetly at these times. And to me, why discount it off the bat?
Yeah, this idea that we almost get these nudges, if you will, where these conditions are created from a celestial perspective that can create. Because I've done a ton of research over the course of time and on the influence of sort of solar radiation, but also cosmic radiation on human consciousness. And there's some fascinating, pretty rigorous research out there that show some interesting relationships specifically between sun cycles and events that happen on the Earth. And this is going back like, hundreds of years. So there's quite a relationship there. And I'm saying this from the standpoint of like, I believe this stuff and I feel this stuff within myself. But for those that are skeptical of this stuff, there is some stuff out there that kind of supports that. And the one thing that I'll say is just because something is happening out there, I don't think it definitely means that every single human being on the planet is suddenly going to change. And it also doesn't mean that this something out there is deciding what happens in your life here. It's more of like a conditions, like you're creating these conditions for openings, these conditions for, something for us to explore a different direction and that kind of stuff. And so I just kind of want to put that out there for those that might be skeptical that it's not like, because I find a lot of metaphysical stuff is completely misinterpreted by people. And so I thought I'd throw it out there for those.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, David, why don't you kick us off with what you think?
Yeah, I think what I'm pondering as we head into this eclipse is the collective consciousness and how we're thinking about this as a humanity. I think sometimes the tendency is to wait for these big events to happen because we feel like they're going to catalyze us into a certain consciousness or a certain type of positioning on the planet. But if we come from the perspective that there's really no beginning or end to consciousness, then there's nothing to wait for. Because if we're waiting for something to do it for us or something to catalyze us into any type of position, then we're taking a passive role. We're not really active in our own consciousness. Also, what I think is interesting is let's just say we all agree with the premise that our conscious reality sort of influences the physical reality in some way, meaning how we think about the world does actually effectuate what happens on the planet. I know that's a controversial topic, but let's just say for a second that we all agree that more or less that's taking place. Well, when I'm observing sort of people's reaction to this eclipse, there is still a lot of apocalyptic consciousness going on. I see a lot of people saying, "Oh my goodness, these earthquakes hit, Taiwan and New Jersey and New York, and we've got wars going on, and people need to run for the hills essentially because this is signifying a biblical prophecy that has been written and foretold, and thus there's some type of calamity that think is going to take place." And I would offer that type of lesson, that type of conscious lesson where we're kind of peering into the darkness and always thinking in apocalyptic terms has run its course on Earth in terms of its utility for us. I think we've learned what we can learn from that. And now it's time for us to essentially, I think, take that burden off our back and say, okay, we've gone into that consciousness. We've seen, and not that things can't get worse, they certainly can. But if that's what we're thinking about when we think about these celestial events that are, as Madhava laid out, are not only extraordinarily rare, but beautiful just in terms of our ability to be able to experience them while we're alive in a short span that we're here in this body. So I would offer that this is always an opportunity, whether it's this eclipse or the next one. I think, last year there were something like 2 eclipses per month or something. Now this is a big one because it's in full totality. Obviously, that's super rare, but I don't think it's the case where it's so significant that we should expect to wake up Tuesday and all of a sudden feel transformed if we haven't gone through that process within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, it's like from a standpoint of, kind of the, I remember, I think back to all these different celestial events that have occurred over the course of time. And there's always this idea that something major, something apocalyptic, something whatever is going to happen. That has often been a discussion, but I think what does continually seem to happen and sort of play into, I'll think back, and this kind of answers your question more directly, Madhava, too. It's I'll think back to the discussion I had with my astrologer friend back in, I believe it was the tail end of 2019. We were talking about, from his perspective, the coming of the age of Aquarius and that discussion, and kind of moving into this age. It's like an entire age where the way that we think about the world, for a long stretch of time was going to start to change. And of course, you started to see that as we led into it. And then it just slowly increases over the course of time. And he was talking about kind of how there would be all these opportunities for more and more of the, I guess, there is no evidence. We're just kind of existing off of superstition. That kind of stuff would start to fall away. A lot of the really strong held beliefs about things that even were based on no evidence, but we all collectively believed them, would start to crumble and fall away. And we'd have a different attunement to how we looked at the world. And he actually said it would be a more scientific one, in a sense of it would be more based on actually looking at the evidence and not just operating off of what we think is happening or what, this is always an interesting discussion, but from an intuitive perspective, I think we misinterpret a lot of times what intuition can be. There's a lot of different sort of times of intuition. And oftentimes I'll hear people say, oh yeah, my intuition is saying this, but it's no, your fear is saying that. It's not your intuition, right? And so there's even, I think, a clearing up of that to some extent. But when we're talking about this, this eclipse, and listening to what you said, Madhava, too, about kind of this revelation, you were talking about, you changed the way your thinking was around 9/11. And I think, we were talking on Telegram and stuff about, just even that CNN interview with RFK, and just you have this discussion of what I'm seeing happening more and more and more is this strongly held sort of mainstream perspective on things, right, is just more and more crumbling. And I feel like worlds are starting to collide more, where some of these independent or alternative sort of perspectives are, by nature of it has to happen, are starting to break their way slowly but surely into mainstream discussion about things. And it's causing people to have to face things that they've never heard of before because they were stuck in their own echo chambers and their own, this is how I think and see the world. And I think it's causing somewhat of a disruption and shaking up the ways in which that people are thinking about things. And I think that goes along with a lot of these big, huge mainstream media stars, so to speak, venturing out of the mainstream circle, creating their own independent outlets, right? And suddenly their tune changes like overnight, right? And so, I think that could be an interesting one. I know you guys both watched the RFK piece. I mean, even just that, like, what do you guys take from that in terms of how that's changed the perspective of the way not only those hosts are going to think about it, but their viewers as well?
Well, this is a really important point that you're bringing up, and how we're examining what's occurring. As David said, eclipses and events are thought of as apocalyptic sometimes, in the sense that there's going to be everybody's going to die, or there's going to be some massive transformation. But notice that all the time things are dying and things are being reborn,
Yeah.
from cells in our body to the way people think individually. And so when you have, individually some kind of awakening, it's like, holy cow, I'm looking at everything differently. But when you're looking at an entire group of people, like 7 billion individuals, or, 330 million people in this country, it can happen, but it's not going to happen overnight, as you both alluded to. It's going to be like more and more people will sort of have that aha moment, like, holy moly, maybe I need to go look at something else, and I've been looking at the whole thing wrong. What we see in the CNN thing, for me at least, it's almost an aha moment for me as well, because I've sort of had this perspective that obviously legacy media is being controlled by their masters, whoever's paying for their ads, and therefore they only talk about certain things. And it's sort of a top-down kind of situation where they control exactly what's going to be said. But then we had this Aaron Burnett RFK interview. And to me, that was pretty stunning that they gave him a voice and a platform. And the reveal to me here is that it's not so cut and dry over there at CNN. There are editors, there are journalists that are thinking for themselves and have been sort of lured into this way of thinking and reporting on things, but they still have some independence. Like, you can't tell me that their managing editor over there didn't see this coming.
Yeah.
Like, the man is an intelligent attorney and is surrounded by scientists and is very articulate. And, how are we supposed to view the fact that they brought him on this platform? Like, was this some sort of, miscalculation by the powers that control CNN? Or are they a amalgamation of different kinds of viewpoints and journalists, and they just sort of say, yeah, well, we need to start talking about this because it's a real problem, and our viewers want to know, how to quiet this man who's taking votes away from our man Joe. That's Joe Biden, Joe. Not talking about you, by the way. So
I still have use of my faculties, mind, and voice. So I think people figured that one out.
right.
That was terrible joke.
No,
No, it
but
was a great joke. It was a great joke.
you're very articulate, and you're not reading from a prompter.
Yeah.
But we can see that CNN is not necessarily, at least what I thought it was, as this monolithic. We're just going to say one thing. They're kind of, a mishmash of different kinds of opinions, and I think they got caught off guard.
Yes, and I also think it represents, when we talk about transformation, that can happen in the individual, but it can also even happen at the institutional level. It's not out of the question that we could see changes take place, even in the most corrupt, rotten aspects of our
Yeah.
institutional structure. I think what struck me about that RFK interview with Aaron Burnett, one, is she gave him about 25 minutes. It wasn't just a typical CNN, hey, let's bring RFK on. Hey, what do you think? Are you anti-vaccine? Okay, let's go to commercial. It was more, no, let's
Right.
let's go long form. Let's really hear him out. I think this signifies a couple things. One is that I do think the appetite of the average news consumer is also changing and also becoming hungrier for truth and hungrier for more authentic content. I mean, all you have to do is look on YouTube, a lot of the independent media creators who are doing well, and a lot of them are not playing the game that mainstream media is playing in terms of filtering things and keeping the parameters so narrow in terms of what you're able to talk about that it either puts people to sleep or it just makes people lose faith and trust that the media is actually giving them information that is enlightening and informs them about the world. So I do think that there potentially could be changes. And also, Bassem Youssef was on Christian Amanpour the other day, another CNN host, speaking about the war in Gaza in very real ways that most CNN audiences, if you're just listening to CNN, that might be the first time you ever heard that perspective in almost 6 months.
Yeah.
Likewise, if you're
Can you,
only a
David,
CNN
can you
viewer,
give an example, David, of a couple of the things that he said that kind of and what the reaction of the host was?
well, one thing that really struck me is he said, there is this feeling in the international community that time is up. Israel needs to close this war out. And I mean, time should have been up a long time ago. But
Yeah.
Yusuf was saying something interesting. He was like, watch what happens. If the war ends tomorrow, he said, people are going to be like, oh my goodness, thank you, Israel, for stopping this war, for ending this war. We're so thankful that you are not killing more Palestinians. Thank you so much. And Christian Amanpour was like, she was struck. She was like, either his sarcasm is very sharp. He's a comedian. And a very smart guy. I think he was a heart surgeon before he turned comedian. But he has this sense of using sarcasm to really drive a point home. And Christian Amanpour was like, well, I don't know. But she literally said, I don't really know how to respond to that. Like as if she had never. It was such a good point because I think it was so predictable, right? And it is true.
Yeah.
Like let's say Netanyahu makes a huge announcement tomorrow, during the eclipse. Hey, the war's over. People would be like, "Oh, thank you so much. We're so happy that we've ended this war and found humanity." And Yusuf's point was there would be no accountability. People would just kind of
Yeah.
say thank
Move on.
you and forget about what happened in Gaza. Let's move on to the next thing. So that was just
Hmm.
one example. But again, if if you're really a hardcore CNN viewer and you don't really consume other media, that may have been the first time you heard this perspective. If you're not actively curating your own timeline on YouTube and looking to hear diverse points of view on this. Um, Likewise, it could have been the first time people had ever heard RFK in that depth and that detail. And
Yeah.
there's utility in that, right? It's one thing to read an Atlantic video on how RFK is the Democratic MAGA or whatever. It's another thing to hear him for 25 minutes and say, okay, wow, I have a better sense of who this guy is and what he represents.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to, for the listeners that aren't familiar with this interview with RFK, it's really worth going back and listening to the full 25 minutes. And it's also interesting to see how it's being spun post-interview, right? Like the talking point is RFK says Biden is a bigger threat to democracy than Trump,
Yeah.
which is supposed to be, inflame the left leaning audience to say, oh my God, it's crazy. How could Joe Biden, be a bigger threat than the orange orangutan over there? And the argument was like very clear. Like the man is using his executive powers to go after the First Amendment.
Yeah.
That's bigger than anything. I mean, I'm sorry. That is absolutely true. If you can't have the First Amendment, forget about democracy. And and what did Aaron have to say to that? I mean, she was kind of stunned because I don't think she even could process what he was saying, but went right to, well, but that means that Biden is worse than Trump. I mean, how
Yeah.
that doesn't fit into my world at all. And the post processing now is happening, which is very fascinating. So I think he attended to himself extremely well, and it's amazing to me that they didn't see this coming. Like this is obvious. Like there, lawsuits out there, and that administration is caught up in influencing social media platforms, that's a no-no, people. If you're Elon Musk or you're Zuckerberg, you can do whatever you want to with your community standards, but you can't have the US government telling you what to do.
Yeah.
This is huge. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I really think that most people who watch CNN completely were unaware of what was going on.
Yeah, and that's really
Yeah.
the gold, I think, in RFK's message is he always talks about breaking up the corrupt merger of government power and private power, essentially, the collusion that takes place. But I think to punctuate Madhava's point, particularly in the context of this eclipse, if you think about the journey we've been on in the past 4 years, even went from RFK, somebody like RFK being deplatformed, not even allowed to have an Instagram account, to getting primetime slot on CNN. I mean, that's an
Yeah.
extraordinary, stark change in 4 years. And it could very well signify sort of hopefully, a relinquishing of an old order that that really sought, excuse me, to control everything via authoritarianism. And obviously that threat still exists. It's going
Yeah.
to take a while to root that out. But I do think that there's more of a collective will to ensure that authoritarianism doesn't suffocate our discourse in a way that's very dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like, funny, David, you brought up the Atlantic. That's still, part of that comes into my email. And of course, every time I see a headline, I can almost guess right off the hop, like, oh yeah, this is Tom Nichols, my boy, right? And he's always, sort of whining about, how bad Trump is and how Biden is, the obvious best choice. But, as we've discussed, and as you were kind of pointing out about that CNN interview, is like, first off, like, I mean, obviously Tom is stuck in an echo chamber to the point where he can't even imagine an argument that suggests Trump is even, let's say, even close in terms of worse or better for America, right? He can't imagine that because he's so lost. And like you were discussing with the CNN host's reaction, oh, I had never even considered that perspective, right? And so now it's like there's almost like we all know, like we can all sit here and say as if it's a cultural normal thing to say that, like, oh yeah, the truth is always somewhere between the middle. It's yeah, and everybody knows what an echo chamber is, and everybody knows that the world's not black and white. Yet everybody's operating it, I should say everybody, it's a collective generalization that a lot of people are operating as if the world is black and white. They're operating as if they're not in an echo chamber, right? And so I see these moments of kind of what you're discussing where it's like, yeah, when you can have a mainstream host or something like that, have to consider something like, man, I'd never heard of that. And by nature, the audience has to take that in. That creates this little opening, and next thing you know, they're going to be a Tucker Carlson who's no longer with mainstream media and creating his own thing,
Right.
and suddenly doing something totally different. And I think, is there still room for these people to become, corrupt or, yes. Are they going to be giving you the quote unquote full truth? No. Are they, but that's not the point. The point is that there's a breaking, there's a shifting, there's a moving to this I should say middle point. I should say more of we're moving to a space where we're having to be less rigid. And I think that's a massive part about what creates a rigid society that cannot change, like we're seeing today in our world, is a rigid collective consciousness, which really is a rigid individual. And part of what's sticking out to me in listening to this is that breaking of rigidity in the individual, which produces a breaking of rigidity in the collective consciousness, which will hopefully, over the course of time, right? Because if you think of authoritarianism, it's very rigid, right? And if we want to root that out, we have to become less rigid as people to create the space for that. And so I think that's part of what's playing out here, is this breaking of rigidity. With more revelation becomes more wisdom. And instead of just pulling on a next world view that's like, Madhava, you were pointing out, for example, this idea that it's like every aspect of mainstream media is controlled and this, that, whatever. Well, maybe it's not quite that way. I think is the wiser position to take. And because it's true, they're still humans. Yes, there's as much power as possible to try and control certain things within these outlets, but when we don't take, let's say, some folks have the black pilled perspective where it's like everything's theater, everything's a show, nothing will ever change, these people have ultimate power, blah, 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 like that sort of doom and gloom perspective, it doesn't represent the actual reality. And so again, I'm just kind of alluding to this idea of wiser, more flexible sort of perspectives that are permeating the mainstream sort of space.
Absolutely. I think Erin Burnett, opened the door with one of her first questions, which was, Bobby, why are you running? Right?
He's like, I'm not, I'm
You know,
sitting.
yeah, because because you're clearly taking votes from Biden and not Trump or whatever. And he responded with this. He said, "Do you want a quick answer or do you want a more thoughtful
Yeah.
answer?"
Mm,
And that was she fell into the trap. She was like, "Well, I want a more thoughtful answer." And after that, forget about it. She had lost control of this man
yeah.
because he was given the chance to articulate. It's like I'm running for president. I don't care whose votes I'm taking from, and I'm not running to like spoil anything. I want to be president. It's like what the hell? And how can you possibly think that I'm taking more from Biden than Trump? And like, why is that even a part of the discussion
Yeah.
when I'm leading? In younger voters over both. I have a greater favorability rating over both. And in swing states, I hold a lead in people under 45. I mean, and for you to sit there and think of me as a spoiler candidate, it's like, no, I have probably the best chance of winning or beating Trump, depending on how you look at it. I mean, like, so the point here is that Aaron was showing, she was relenting in her rigidity,
Yeah.
looking for a more, thoughtful response and not the black and white. Just give me some stupid answers that I can move on. So I agree with what you're saying completely there. We have to become, look, let's collective evolution, for example.
It's a
I,
good
I
name.
think you're, yeah, well, it's good. You've done some good things, but I would generally think and say to summarize the kind of information that you bring to your viewer is about destroying rigidity,
Yeah.
not telling you the way things must be, but notice where you think that you're so absolutely confident and ask yourself, like, can I really justify that level of certainty? Because that's the whole, that's the problem. That's the
Yeah.
nut to crack is like, you have to let go of your need for certainty before you can get anywhere. Because if you're certain about something, forget about it. There's no evolution in your way of thinking.
Yeah. David, you got a response, or can I throw to a Guardian piece here that I read this morning to add more to this
Yeah,
RFK discussion?
let's go to the Guardian.
All right, so
Really?
yeah,
Right to the Guardian? I wanted
so
someone to say, Madhava completely hit it out of the park with
yeah,
that.
Well,
that was
that was
bingo bango.
actually my way of saying that. Hey, Madhava is pretty much anything I'll say will be
He covered
repetitive
it
here.
all.
So
Yeah.
Right.
No, it was well said. It was well said. But
Yeah.
I was reading this piece this morning. It's titled "He Can Help Trump Win. U.S. Groups Take on RFK Jr. After No Labels Stands Down." And it's basically about these advocacy groups that are going after RFK because the idea is that he's dangerous, right? These are some of the direct quotes use words like, he's dangerous because he can pull votes away from Biden, which will cause Trump to win. So you have the multiple advocacy groups going after RFK, and as I'm reading this, right, you obviously have these very inflamed quotations throughout the article coming from the advocacy groups, but then you also have just like the writer and the writer's own words. The way they'll define Kennedy is like Kennedy, an environmental attorney, conspiracy theorist, and member of a famous political family, right? Like they're just the way they're framing this. And I'm thinking to myself, like, imagine if every time they wrote about Biden, it was like, Biden, the sitting U.S. president, alleged pedophile and corrupt criminal. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, imagine they just did that, right? It would totally change people's perspective. But aside from that, it's like you're hearing these groups talk about how, RFK is just a conspiracy theorist. He has no reason. There's no, like, you can't talk to him because he's not a reasonable person. And I'm thinking to myself, like, you have these people that probably have a ton of money behind what they're doing, unable to see that. I think if anybody sat still, sat calm, grounded in themselves and listened to Trump, Biden, and RFK, I do not see how somebody would think that RFK is less reasonable than those other two guys. Like, he is clearly the most reasonable person out of the three of them. And yet the way they view it is, hold on a second, my team has to win. This guy's a threat to my team, right? And we're just talking about rigidity here. We're going back to that point of like these people are so stuck that they can no longer see the world for what it is. They don't take the time to see the world for what it is. And I think that is really the piece that has to keep breaking. And I think there's always going to be the group of the collective that holds on to that to kind of push and encourage the others forward to see how silly that is in a sense. Or I should say just more like how unproductive that is. But it's this is the kind of stuff that I'm seeing. I read this piece and it was just like, man, I'm living in a different world than these people, right?
Right. Well, I mean
Hmm.
that's the intellectual dishonesty that I think is so frustrating that people
Yeah.
now are, I think, have had are up to capacity with it and are ready to move on to something else. Even after the Aaron Burnett interview, she had on a bunch of Republican and Democratic operatives who were, particularly the DNC representative, was calling RFK one of the most dangerous people in the world. So and it's
Yeah.
just crazy. But by the way, what you just said about Biden, I mean, you can go on plenty right wing popular stations and they'll say Biden is, a predator, the Biden crime family.
Yes.
I mean, so they're going to say all this stuff. They just like they, assassinate Trump on the left. But
Yeah.
I agree with you in the sense that now, by the way, um, as you both know, I have serious reservations about RFK because of his position on Gaza and Israel. However, I think when I'm looking at those three, RFK is the only one who has, I think, the internal fortitude and the capacity to actually do something about the corruption in our country. Trump and Biden are just custodians over it. I mean, whatever you think about both of them, they both had their chance to be president. Both administrations have been riddled with swamp monsters. And actually, RFK made that point about Trump appointing John Bolton. There's no way you can say that you're against forever wars and then bring John Bolton in to run your foreign policy as Trump did. So, I think RFK is really the only one capable and the only one with the political will to actually go into the White House and break up the institutional decay that has plagued both Trump and Biden's administrations.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. You hit it out of the park, David. You really hit it out of the park. I think that one aspect to Bobby's campaign is that he needs to really capitalize on the fact that neither Trump nor Biden has pardoned Assange and Snowden.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, forget about the vaccine, environmental stuff, and all these other things where he can clearly outdistance himself from the other two candidates. It's like you were there for 4 years, Don, and talking about how you're going to drain the swamp and attack the deep state and reveal. And you sat there and you didn't sign your name onto an executive order pardoning those two patriots. Your whole your whole argument is sorry, is to me pointless now. You're just speaking, and it doesn't make any sense. And President Biden, you're doing the same exact thing. Now,
Well,
as Americans and patriots, we should just say that should be enough. Like, we can disagree about Gaza and his support of Israel. You don't even have to believe all of his anti-vax misinformation. But if you can't have a government that protects those who speak out and call out the government, then you don't have a democracy anymore.
but how do we know
Um,
that this is not evidence of the degree of power, though, that sits behind? Because obviously, when we are all in agreement that a president can try and shape some of the culture of the government, but really the power exists in the unelected officials that are kind of really involved in a lot more back there. So, for example, just as a devil's advocate here, it's like, how do we know that maybe somebody like Trump did want to pardon somebody like Snowden or Assange, but couldn't because other forces were saying, no, if you do this, you're going to lose X, or, that I feel like that still has to be on the table here from the standpoint of, um, look at, the Kennedy assassination, right? What if he said during that meeting, no, you know what, I'm gonna do what I want to do regardless of what you're telling me, and boom, dude gets dusted, right? So the question is how do we know that that's not at play?
Well, I think it could be at play. I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. I think it could be at play, but too bad for you, 45 and 46. Like, you were controlled, and now we're going to call you out for it. You should have taken the bullet. You should have done what you said. And Bobby is in the unique position of never uh, uh, having been in the Oval Office. So use that, get in the
Yeah.
office and then, kowtow to the deep state. I don't know. But, it's political strategy, people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, think about that admission, what that means if you're Trump and you say, "Oh, well, I wanted to do this, but I couldn't because I was scared that, even though I'm the president, I'm supposed to be the head of the snake, the most powerful person in the world, but I'm scared of what these other people might do to me, so I'm not going to be bold." And actually, RFK addressed this, and he's addressed this head on when people have asked him, "Hey, are you afraid that they're going to, do you like your dad and uncle?" And he says, "No, I'm not." He basically says that the tradition he grew up in, surrounding his family and the moral imperative that I think most of us would ascribe to the Kennedy dynasty rightfully, has been one of courage that says, I'm going to do what I think is right for the people and stand up for principles regardless of the consequences, even if it means an assassination attempt. That's leadership. That's somebody who says, hey, I'm not coming here just to be a show pony and kind of do a couple things. I'm actually coming to make the difficult decisions that, yeah, maybe will create some animosity from those who don't want to see me do this, but that's what leadership requires. And again, I think that's why Bobby Kennedy, out of these three choices, is the only one capable uh, and has the political will to do that.
Yeah. Look, I mean, exactly right. He, if you want to really examine this, almost from a biblical perspective, I mean, running for president is probably one of the most dangerous things this man can do. As
Hmm.
as as Bobby Kennedy Jr., son of a slain attorney general, nephew of a slain U.S. president, standing for those values of cleaning up corruption. And he saw what happened to his uncle and his father, and he's running anyway. I mean, you
Yeah.
must give the man some credit for this.
Yeah.
It's like he knows that this is they're coming for him, and he doesn't care. And as David alluded to, I mean, I think he said, "Look, there's much worse things than dying.
Yeah.
Let's be real." Powerful statement. Like I would like to see the other, how the other candidates respond to that.
Speaking of his uncle's assassination, I know we were chit-chatting a little bit about some of the latest sort of examinations of some of the evidence from the shooting. And, I know this has to do with, the old, I was thinking about it, the old magic bullet theory in grade 10. I live in Canada, you guys live in the US. So we have a course that you can take in, I think it's grade 10, where you can do American history. And I took it, mainly because I needed a history course. No, but the JFK assassination is a part of it. And I remember sitting in class very vividly because I kind of enjoyed the teacher in the class and she kept things kind of exciting. And we go over the magic bullet theory, which is the still standing perspective of how Kennedy was killed by a single bullet through the back of his head and bounced off 18 bazillion things and, shot him again and blah, blah, blah. And I like the entire class thought that this theory, that is the standing, this is how he died, was the most ridiculously bullshit thing. And like everybody knows this, but it was funny because even back then to consider a different perspective was a conspiracy. That would be you were a conspiracy theorist to consider a different perspective, yet everything about the official story was clearly not true. And so, with that as a boilerplate, I know you guys, I think both were, I haven't seen this, but you guys are both chit-chatting about about some of that latest evidence, if somebody wants to kind of expand on that a bit.
Kim Iverson brought on this person who wrote a book whose name I can't remember, and it's about like a re-examination of the evidence, and the evidence is in the form of radiographs of X-rays of JFK's skull that have been preserved in the archives, and he did some an examination of these radiographs, like of the negatives, and demonstrated that for sure these things have been altered to hide evidence of other bullets. The shrapnel or the dust that occurs when a bullet makes contact with the skull and will leave some track marks. And he's shown definitively that they've been altered. And like, and the point here is that this is what I mean by the reveal. Like, is this a reveal? Look, oh, it's been revealed to us. No, it depends on you personally. Are you going to believe it or not? Like, you have to figure out, is this enough for you to change your mind? So this is why I think it's interesting, is that it doesn't matter how much evidence is out there. Like, you as an individual have to decide whether or not you're going to consider that evidence valid and that evidence invalid. And so this is where we're at right now. I think what's curious about what's happening is that you have a journalist like Kim Iverson who has a substantial following talking about these things, and it wasn't so long ago that she had on my friend Ted Walter, who is the head of some 9/11 truth organization. Sorry, Ted, I can't remember what it's called, but asking questions about 9/11. Like, this is really big and something that I would have never imagined could have happened the last time we had a solar eclipse,
Yeah,
2017.
What?
interestingly, oh, go ahead, David. Go
Please,
ahead.
please, Joe, go ahead.
I was just going to say, interestingly, when it comes to the topic of 9/11, like, I know people personally who, they're newer to the independent alternative sphere of media, meaning they're starting to consider alternative sources. And as they've heard the reasonable arguments, coming out of these platforms, they're going, yeah, no, now I don't know if I really believe what I was told about 9/11, because again, the arguments are so reasonable. And I did have another point I wanted to make about skeptics, but David, why don't you throw down what you had on that
Well,
topic
just real
there?
quick, I was going to bring up the point that the JFK assassination is somewhat of an outlier in sort of American consciousness when it comes to conspiracy, because there's now a strong majority of Americans who don't believe the official JFK assassination story told by the government. And the reason why that's significant is because I think it's the only event that I can think of, huge event, where there is a consensus amongst the people that, yeah, this something is wrong here. Uh, what we've been told is a lie. And
Yeah.
also in the aftermath of the JFK assassination, I really think this is a pivotal point in American history, because to me there was a clear takeover, if you want to call it deep state or the deep intelligence agency, CIA, Bush Dulles, the Bush Dulles legacy that really took over and took hold of our government following the JFK assassination. And think about what we've had since then. Vietnam War debacle, Iraq War debacle. Almost every war we've entered has been under a false pretense, a lie from the intelligence community. Um,
Yeah.
Not to mention, what happened in the past 4 years. Not to mention our foreign policy and all across the world, what we've done, with the Henry Kissinger legacy. All of this transpired after JFK was assassinated, and it signified a very sharp pivot in United States leadership. And that's why I also think Bobby's candidacy is so interesting, because most of us weren't alive during that time when JFK was assassinated, but we do, and those who are alive have the institutional memory of a different America, but we can actually, do our due diligence and look at the historic leadership of, leaders like Jack Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, FDR. I mean, these were leaders who draw stark contrast to the leaders that came after JFK. And that so it's something that requires us, I think, to look much deeper and have uncomfortable conversations. 9/11, perhaps the most important conversation to have if we want to understand not just sort of deep state intelligence agencies in the new century, but really the architecture and the psychology of how the people of the United States have been sort of drawn into acquiescing to this kind of leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes
Yeah,
sense.
I mean, look, like you said, David, there aren't a whole lot of people around anymore that were adults when Jack Kennedy was murdered. We're all getting older. Even Bobby himself was only, I think, 7 or 8 years old and didn't really understand, necessarily what was going on. but we have to stop, like like the Dulles Bush legacy that you alluded to. I mean, President Kennedy publicly said that he was, what was it, like he's going to crush the CIA and scatter its remnants to the winds. Out there saying that. Who was the head of the CIA? It was Allen Dulles. Who gets appointed, head of the Warren Commission? It's like, isn't that enough for you to understand that this was all just a complete circus? So, and, we could say, the same things about the 9/11 Commission. We have Philip Zelikow heading that up, who happens to be also the commissioner of the COVID-19 investigatory whatever. I mean, like this, the same people keep showing up. They keep doing what they're supposed to be doing. And like how long is it going to take?
Right.
And-
And
Yeah.
it's such an important point about who does these investigations. It's like the police investigating the police when they, have police brutality. It's like, we're going to look into this. Or even now, the IDF, we're going to do our own investigation as to what happened with us killing the World Central Kitchen aid workers. We're going to do our own investigation, which is independent
Yeah.
somehow, right? So yeah, I mean, that's always the telltale sign that it's a sham investigation and there's a cover-up.
And speaking of
Yeah.
that, I mean, this is just to interject here with the point about the importance of this is because, you know, you have these investigations, you have the who does it, and it creates a standard for what is the story that becomes the bedrock of how we think about that event. And then it is now future evidence that has to be so undeniable in order for everybody to change their mind. And yet we're going to look at that new evidence with way more rigor than we would have ever have looked at the initial bedrock story that was put forth. And so my critique of skeptics is they're always putting every piece of effort and skill and energy towards debunking any piece of new evidence that comes out about anything, whether it's vaccines, RFK assassination, 9/11, anything, but not even an ounce of the same amount of effort has gone into challenging the bedrock story to begin with. And I think this is where there's an issue, is that when something becomes the mainstream thought, even the scientific approach is to say, well, it's going to be extraordinary what you have to bring to overtake what we have, regardless of whether what we have was established in a meaningful way. And of course, this is a different conversation when we're talking about cultural events like 9/11 and JFK versus when you're talking about scientific theories that indeed do have a ton of evidence to support them. So not to conflate the two, but when we're talking about something like a JFK assassination, skeptics should not be holding so aggressively to that initial story. When it comes to 9/11, skeptics should not be holding so aggressively to that initial story because we don't have good evidence for what happened, right? But it should not take so much for us to become open and uncertain about the story. It shouldn't take such an extreme amount of evidence. And to that point, I mean, the implications of overturning the story is not suddenly like the sun won't rise the next day and we'll all die as human beings. The implications are a slow cultural change that is huge, slowly. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. This, what you've just brought up there, I think has some real tie-ins with this eclipse,
Yeah.
in the sense that when we look at these professional skeptics that, as you said, have unbalanced inquiry, let's say, we also if they actually took what's so
I
funny?
just every time we have an inside joke that like nobody else
No,
will get, but I get it.
I love a little plug to the master class. I love it.
the master class. Yes, everybody should take the master class taught by the masters themselves. So what I want to say here is that if we were to actually examine if we were to examine the skeptics and how they come to their conclusions about what is valid evidence, they would eventually have to concede that they categorize evidence based on whether or not there is an institution that has brought it forward, as opposed to an independent researcher that says, hey, I found something. It's like, no, we have to be skeptical of this, but there's no reason for us to be skeptical of the CDC or the 9/11 Commission.
Yeah.
And I hope that we can all understand, and hopefully this conversation is going to get out there. It's like, notice what has happened. Someone, somewhere, someplace, somewhen, has created these institutions that have served as a surrogate for sense making. They're really powerful. I mean,
Yeah.
like you have the CDC, which won't be questioned by 90% of doctors because they're the CDC.
Yeah.
They can say whatever they want to, and they can back it up with evidence that doesn't really make sense. But if you try to challenge it, it's like, oh, well, you're not, do you work for the CDC? You're not an epidemiologist. I'm going to go with the CDC,
Yeah.
which is actually constructed of, not a whole lot of like true researchers or scientists, a lot of, mathematicians. But the point here is that we have these institutions that are now guiding the way we think about things collectively. And we have to be able to understand that if we were going to take that down, we need to become clear about what we are being given as evidence. This is what I think the eclipse is about. It's like, how are you going to know what evidence is actually valid and what isn't? How are you going to know? Without believing somebody else? This is the key point. This is the weak link in your understanding of the world, is that you are giving your trust over to someone else to tell you what is valid and what isn't.
Yeah.
And as long as you don't want to do the work and you don't want to actually question the way you're looking at things, forget about it. You just go ahead and believe the CDC or the 9/11 Commission or the Warren Commission, whatever commission or omission you want to believe. You're going to have to do it, or you're going to have to do the hard work and look at things openly. And I would suggest, another, bias that's always in play here is when you discount a conclusion, discount evidence because of the conclusion that it leads to. You are putting things backwards.
Yeah.
You may be right, you may be wrong, but you're doing it backwards. And that is the largest impediment that we're having right now, and it's being used against us.
Yeah, 100%. It's the first time I've said that today. So
100%.
I'm proud of myself,
Hit
by the
out of
way.
the park.
But this also gets to where we have to reevaluate presumptive legitimacy and who we just defer to and outsource our own critical thinking to, as Madhava was pointing out. And I do think there is an opportunity now to do that. And I actually agree that, if there is sort of an astrological elemental principle to this eclipse, it is, I think, people getting more in the driver's seat of their consciousness and realizing that, it may not be a comfortable realization that we can't trust a lot of our institutions, but unfortunately, that's where we're at. And once we acknowledge that, then it gets to the point where, okay, well, I actually have to take a more active role in formulating my view of the world. And
Yeah.
it's healthy, right? That's taking responsibility, personal responsibility. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that there can't be institutions built on trust at some point.
Yeah.
It just means it doesn't mean we have to be anti every institution ever. It just means that we have to start seeding these institutions with integrity, and that's a long process. But we can't get there until we actually have an initial realization that we've been lied to. There's mass deception going on, and hopefully an eclipse can be a pivotal point to that. I do think a lot of it is also perspective. For example, you could look at the earthquakes that just happened in Taiwan, New Jersey, New York, with all the aftershakes, and say, oh, well, this means we need to just get out of Dodge. Like, let's pack our bags and move to some faraway island. Or you could take that and look at, maybe we need to find our grounding. Maybe this is an opportunity to understand that we've been maybe shaken off our balance and find our center. So those are two different ways to look at the same event. One is laden with fear. The other is laden with the call towards personal responsibility and action, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just to add something quick is just to say, like, especially if, the conspirituality guys are somehow watching this, I'm just kidding. But no, but, it's just the idea that oftentimes what you see is, oh, I don't trust the CDC. Well, everything they say is a lie, right? And then, of course, that becomes, the moment people start saying that, those that you're trying to open up go, well, obviously everything the CDC says isn't a lie, so now you sound like a lunatic, right? So it's this idea that it's like these institutions aren't necessarily lying to you 100% of the time. It's just this idea that I think what we're pointing to here is getting into this space of questioning and being more responsible for how we look at things, and not just jumping from, oh, these are the institutions that need to be trusted and everything they say is true, to, oh, everything they say is a lie. But getting to that point where we're able to kind of look at and better understand what is true and what is a lie or deception or manipulation or part of a political or some sort of game that's being played to some extent. I wanted to add that into the picture because it's so common in the alternative sphere to just jump to the other extreme in a sense.
Yeah, that's a massive problem, and it's potentially people who do that are creating a greater impediment to clarity than those of us who are saying don't trust the media or don't trust the CDC. David, you said something really worth hitting upon again, which is we have to trust institutions. Like it doesn't, we have to. But in order to find an institution you can trust, you have to get rid of the conflict of interest. You have to start there. Like Alan Dulles, Warren Commission, conflict of interest. The CDC and Big Pharma, conflict of interest. What we need here is a leader that will, has pinpointed that as being the first problem that must be attacked.
Yeah.
I wonder who can do that, to put it out there. I wanted to say something else about institutions, if I may, and it ties into this whole celestial astrological thing. The other sort of transition that we're going through astrologically and astronomically is now Pluto is in Aquarius. And I think we talked about this last time. And the last time this occurred, and this again has to do with a revelation in how we think about science and information. The last time this happened was at the end of the 18th century, which saw the French and American Revolution and the introduction of vaccines against smallpox back then. And now here we are 240 years later, and we're talking about, well, gosh, this democracy isn't really a democracy if it's being owned by corporate interests, and we have all of this corruption, and vaccines that were supposed to be absolutely like the biggest, best thing for humanity are now being questioned for exactly what is their utility and what is their safety. But if you go back to the previous time that Pluto was in Aquarius, which I'm guessing here, it was about 200 years before the end of the 18th century, that puts it pretty much smack dab in the Western European Renaissance. And that was another huge transformation, which was like, oh, the church is lying to us. And we have this new thing called science and the scientific method that will, deliver us from confusion. And, now that again is sort of on the chopping block. Is like, how do we trust the scientific institutions that we have, as you said, given our trust to? That's also up for discussion. And that's all happening. And the earth is shaking.
Yeah.
And
maybe we're going. Maybe
and CNN is opening.
exactly. Maybe we're moving from the age of reason to the age of intuition. By the way, big plug to an insult to intuition Substack there. See what I did there, Mark?
Bingo, bango,
We go.
bingo, bango. Yeah, and I think this is kind of the pieces that maybe. I mean, this is what I believe, so I'll just go out and say it. But and I think you guys resonate. But I do also think there's a sort of a fundamental shift in consciousness occurring whereby we have the lessons of our past in the various cycles we've been through, and we have an opportunity to merge that sort of scientific mind, that reasonable mind, with the intuitive heart or the intuitive mind, if you want to talk about how these things are all interconnected as part of a whole anyway. They're engaging with each other almost momentarily as they communicate. And a new human is emerging in a sense that is centered, is grounded more. And of course, I'm not saying that just happens at overnight. Like, it takes effort and work to attune to that part of ourselves that more, what I would venture to say, is a natural state. that we've been deeply divorced from for so many different reasons, including just how the Industrial Revolution has kind of pulled us out of a natural environment in such an aggressive way, and the systems that we've built on top of that, reflective of a competitive, domineering type mindset within human beings, has pulled us even further out of our nature. And I think we're kind of maybe coming back to that more. There's a desire. We're seeing how kind of sick and ill and tired we are of this very, very modern type world. But there's a natural state that we can attune to, that we can experience. And the question is can we have that emerge more greatly on a regular basis, such that, yeah, we're not just full on faith, we're not full on, science is everything, but we're much more balanced in that, where, as, Ian McGilchrist would put it, the master and the emissary, which is like saying, when the left brain becomes the master, this straight, logical, nothing, it sees everything as separate, as, all these bits and pieces, super reductionist. When that becomes the master, it will push down the whole, the unity, the beauty, the ability for us to think complexity. Whereas when the right side of the brain is the master, it knows when to use the logic. It knows when to stick with the intuition, with the heart, right? And I think there's a fundamental shift happening there, if we want to talk about it even just from a more physiological perspective. But I think there's spirituality in that. I think that's part of what's changing potentially this time, if I want to be idealistic, than versus some previous changes in the past.
Very well said. And I think having these experiences, like the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, were amazing accomplishments for humanity. But I think sometimes what happens is people will sort of adapt and embrace scientific methodology and reason, and the byproduct of that is to reject any semblance of spirituality now. And so it's like to suppress one huge dimension of our consciousness in favor of another, as opposed to looking at these almost like infinity stones. Okay, we got the enlightenment, we got the reason, we got the spirituality, and now they're walking in unison together, not necessarily opposed. And,
Yeah.
humanity to me is just about vast experience. It's like, you got the reason, you got the enlightenment, you got the intuition, you got the t-shirt and the postcard, you got everything, you went on all the rides. So now enjoy the experience of it, as opposed to always having these rivalries. And I think, many people on Madhava, I think you've talked about this as well, sort of adopt almost a religious approach to the scientific method, to where they're rejecting anything now outside of that parameter. And that becomes a very narrow way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Yes, it requires a lot of balance between the right and left hemispheres. You need them both. You can think a thought so repetitively and intensely that you can generate a physiological reaction, and then you can misinterpret that as I feel it in my heart, I feel it in my gut. Well, really, maybe it's just because you're feeling nausea because you're so scared
Yeah.
about something that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I look, I don't know what I was going to say particular to that, but I did want to say something about how these things build on each other. This is like the clockwork. We would not have been able to create a democracy, the first time since the Greeks, let's say, or a vaccine in the late 18th century if we didn't have the Renaissance 240 years before. And we're not going to be able to challenge the things like institutions if the institutions don't exist that we created, over the last 200 years. I mean, it's this. We're doing the same thing, but the environment in which we're doing it is different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. That's all. Does anybody have any final words before we close this off?
Well, I'm really curious to see, what's going to happen between now and when you release this, right? We have,
Yeah.
I don't know what
Yeah.
your plan is. Maybe we're not going to be here at all, and you should probably record it someplace and bury it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be on an airplane crossing the Atlantic, so I'm curious to see what kind of I got a window seat too, so I'm pretty excited about that. Although it's going to be at the tail end. I think I'm at least where I'm at in the Northeast. It's around 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. I think, Madhava, when the eclipse is going to hit.
Yes.
But I would just say,
Yep.
enjoy wherever you're at on the planet. Enjoy a really a once in a lifetime for many people type of event. This is not something that comes around often, and it's a beautiful time of reflection, but also just a beautiful time to be alive and be able to witness something like this, which only comes across once every what? How many moons?
No, a solar eclipse is not that infrequent. I think it happens like every 18 months or
But
so, but
totality though.
well, no, not just, well, totality is particularly rare, but the point here is that the axis of the moon's orbit is not completely aligned with our plane of with the sun, and so the moon gets in the way of the sun a lot, but it doesn't necessarily cast a shadow on the Earth at all sometimes. So it's not as infrequent as we realize, but as you said, totality in a place where we can get to, that's pretty rare. Like, not only are you dealing with the celestial mechanics of the whole thing, you also have to deal with weather. So I do believe that most people on the planet who have lived have not seen a total solar eclipse for that reason.
Yeah. That's it. That's all. Gentlemen, as always, thanks for coming on, sharing your thoughts, insights, wisdom, and looking forward to the next time. Hopefully, maybe even sooner than later.
Me too.
100%.
Thanks, Joe.